Hi everyone, my name is Jason Radford and I'm the CEO of Volunteer Science. Today I'm going to talk about how to integrate Qualtrics surveys and volunteer science studies. Now, I want to cover first why you would use each one and why both together are more than the sum of their parts. Next, I want to talk about posting a survey to Volunteer Science. How do you take a Qualtrics survey that you've created and put it on Volunteer Science? So there's a couple of ways you can do that. Third, I'm going to talk about how to embed volunteer science studies within Qualtrics. So build whatever you want in volunteer science and embed it within a survey. And lastly, I'm going to talk about sharing data between volunteer science and Qualtrics. How do you keep the lines of communication open between the two platforms to keep the study moving or to share data? So let's get started. So why Qualtrics and why volunteer science? Now the strength of Qualtrics is that it's very easy, very powerful survey creator. I've been using Qualtrics for at least 10 years to create my own surveys. It's very easy to use. There's a lot that you can do. The problem is that it's relatively limited in its functionality. You can't do behavioral studies like cognitive tasks like the Stroop task or the flanker task. There's no multi-person support, so you can't have multiple people working on a survey together or interacting simultaneously while participating in a survey. And you can't do interactive interfaces. So if you want to have people click and drag or add elements to a page as part of their experience on your survey, you can't really do that with Qualtrics. So it's really good at what it does, but it's fairly narrow. On the other hand, volunteer science, the strength is that it's powerful. You can create most any study that you want. The problem is that it's relatively complex and there's no simple survey maker that's as powerful as Qualtrics. So what I want to argue today is that you use the strengths of each. So when you want to create a nice survey and you want to do it easily, you do it in Qualtrics, and then you need to do something complicated or powerful, you do it in volunteer science, and then you can blend them together. So what does that look like? So the first is you have a Qualtrics survey and you just want to put it up on volunteer science because we have a really nice interface for participants to see your study, find it, and for you to put your best foot forward. You can find a nice graphic. You can put up your study description that's meant to tell people what the study is about and why it's important to participate and what they'll do. Not the consent form, but more like your survey flyer. We also have a leaderboard and some estimated times to help subjects really make a strong, solid decision about whether to participate in your study. The next thing is you want to tap into our crowd. So we have hundreds of people coming to volunteer science every day, participating in studies, and if you want to have those participants participate in your survey, you could take your Qualtrics survey, put it in volunteer science, and post it online, and we'll show you how to do that. If you want to tap into Mechanical Turk using Qualtrics, you sort of can. Mechanical Turk has support for you to put in the link to a Qualtrics survey, and then you use a code at the end of your survey to link up the Mechanical Turk worker with your data to pay them manually later. That's kind of a pain in the butt. Volunteer Science provides some easy code that you can use to automatically pay participants when they're done, as long as they qualify or that they participated well. We allow you to manage your qualifications and requirements. So if somebody finishes, you can issue a qualification that allows them to take the next study that they qualify for. And again, there's a sample creator on Volunteer Science. So if you wanted to use your survey with a quota sample, for example, make sure that 50% of the Turkers are women and 50% are men, you could do that on Volunteer Science in a relatively easy, integrated way. And lastly, a lot of what we see here is a combination of surveys and experiments. And this is one that we did while I was at Northeastern University, where on the right-hand side we have a Qualtrics survey that's asking participants questions about the images, which are Facebook ads. On the left-hand side, this is a way of tagging those images. So the question is, what does this image look like? Is it fully visible? Is the text visible? Is there anything missing? And we used this to do a study of online political ads back in 2016. So in this case, we're combining Volunteer Science's ability to render Facebook ads and store a whole bunch of Facebook ads, show them to Turkers, with Qualtrics' powerful ability to create very easy, very quick surveys to collect data. Okay, so how do you post a survey to Volunteer Science? Two ways. First off, in the abstract, the way that it works is through iframes. So somebody's on the Volunteer Science webpage in a Volunteer Science study, and we create what's called an iframe, which is just one line of HTML code there at the bottom. Iframe where the source is equal to the URL for your Qualtrics survey. And what an iframe does is it basically creates a little tunnel to Qualtrics or to any URL that you can put into your iframe. And you can interact with that website through the iframe while you're still on the website that you were starting from. So that's how all of this works, really. But at least for this particular posting surveys up to Volunteer Science. You create a study on Volunteer Science and you just create an iframe with the URL to your Qualtrics survey. So how do you do that? One, we have a template that's just a Qualtrics survey template. You can clone that template, create your own version of it, and then under the Manage Variables tab, you can put the link to your Qualtrics survey there. Click that green update button, and voila, you have a survey up on Volunteer Science. I have 2 demo videos showing you how to do this. I'll put them in the links in the description. After you put the survey in an experiment, you then post it online. This is sort of step 2. So you put it up online, you attach your images, your study description. Again, there's a demo video for that. And then you're done. You've got your Qualtrics survey is an experiment, and you have that experiment posted up on the internet. The second way of doing this is embedding the survey in an existing study. So this is just taking that iframe HTML code and pasting it somewhere in an existing study. So step 1, create your study on Volunteer Science. In the case here, I have the Qualtrics in chat, which has its own demo video, which I'll link again, where it's just the chat room that we have, plus the Qualtrics snippet, this iframe. And so that's all you do. You add that iframe into your code and you're done. Now you'll of course want to make it look nice or make sure that it shows up at the right time of your study. But those are sort of additional details to making it work the way that you want. The basic step here is just making sure that the iframe object is added to your code. And that's it. So a couple of examples. You can run a survey experiment. So why would you run surveys on Volunteer Science, or how does this work? Say you build a survey experiment in Qualtrics. You can recruit subjects on Volunteer Science, have Qualtrics do that randomization, and be done in a week. The next thing that you can do is you can validate a new measure, particularly a psychometric measure. In the validation paper that we published in 2016, we verified that you could find the 5 dimensions of the Big 5 personality using volunteers, specifically volunteers on Volunteer Science, again, to validate that there are 5 dimensions of personality. So if you have a new survey measure that measures some construct, you can validate it on Volunteer Science. Lastly, you can study specific attitudes. So in this case, we have a study that was recruiting women aged 18 to 25 about their social media use during the time of COVID-19. In this case, you have your Qualtrics survey, and then you put it up on Volunteer Science looking for a specific group of people who come to our website every day of the week. So let's talk about doing it the other way. How do you embed Volunteer Science experiments in Qualtrics? Again, it works through iframes. Same way, except this time you're on the Qualtrics survey page, and within the survey, you open up the iframe into a Volunteer Science study. And it's the same line of code, it's just using the Volunteer Science URL instead of the Qualtrics study URL. So how does this work? In the future, more of you will probably recognize this. This is Qualtrics' new sort of updated looking interface for creating surveys. It works basically the same as the most recent version. I think it's weird that it's on the left-hand side, but generally you have the same question types and editing features. So what you do is in Qualtrics, you create a new text item. So usually this is the kind of item that you use to give instructions or do vignettes. It's just a big text box with no responses. And you then go to the HTML view. So this is the red circle HTML view. You click into HTML view, and then you add your iframe. Same HTML code, same URL. Here in this example, we have join category equals 123, which is the link to a specific study on volunteer science. That's how you know your link is going to a specific study, as if it has that join category 1, 2, 3. And then you're done. Again, there's a demo video that I'll link in the comments. But what happens is, when you get to that page on your Qualtrics survey, that iframe is going to load. People will see the study and be able to take the volunteer science study right there in that block on your survey. There's a lot more that you can do with CSS to make it bigger or centered, or hide some of the extraneous things to the left and to the right. But this is just the core of how you get a volunteer science experiment into Qualtrics. A couple of examples. We have a flanker task on volunteer science that you can just, as a template, so you can create your own version of it, and then put it up online, and then have your Qualtrics survey point to that flanker experiment. And so you have somebody do their survey, do a flanker task, come back, or not come back, move on to the next piece of the study, and never actually leave Qualtrics. The next thing that you could do is creating multiplayer studies in Qualtrics. So you can have one of your pages is a chat room, or part of your page on Qualtrics is a chat room. People can talk about the questions or the vignette or whatever it is that you have in your survey. And then, at least in this case, you can have one of the participants put in the responses that people come up with together in your chat room. Lastly, another last example, collecting verified social media data. So one of the things that volunteer science can do is request people's Twitter handle and Twitter data. You can grab that using volunteer science while people are still within a Qualtrics survey. So it's a lot more reliable than just having an open text box that says, hey, what's your Twitter handle? You can actually have a little button that says, can we request your Twitter handle? That pop-up comes up where they get consent, and then you get the Twitter handle, the actual Twitter handle. Okay, last section on sharing data. How do you communicate between volunteer science and Qualtrics? A couple of reasons why you would want to. One, most important, is to be able to link responses. So say you have data in Qualtrics and data in volunteer science. There's no automatic way to know, which survey response is which study data in volunteer science. And so what you want to do is you want to share a user ID. So volunteer science has a native user ID. Qualtrics has a native user ID. You can use this method to link those up. They won't be the same, but in volunteer science, you can save the Qualtrics ID, or in Qualtrics, you save the volunteer science ID. Next, synchronizing activity. So one of the things that you definitely want to make sure happens is when your Qualtrics study is done, the volunteer science study picks back up. Or when you're in Qualtrics, the flanker task or whatever is done, and then move on to the next page. So just making sure that Qualtrics knows when volunteer science is done, or volunteer science knows when Qualtrics is done. There's a lot of other synchronization things that you can do, but that's a primary case. Lastly is just storing data. So sometimes you want all your data in Qualtrics because it's nicely structured, or sometimes you want it in volunteer science because it's not nicely structured and you need a nice JSON block of data. And so you can send data between Qualtrics and volunteer science using the methods that we're about to talk about. So the first method are using is using embedded variables. Now, embedded variables are these things that you see at the end of a URL after the question mark. Now, question mark in a URL denotes URL parameters, and so everything after the question mark is some parameter name, in this case like user ID, the equal sign, and a variable amount. So in this case, user ID equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then it's separated by ampersands. So we can say user ID 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and condition equals A. So this would be user 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in condition A. And that's the way you would pass that data from Qualtrics to volunteer science. Oh, no, sorry, from volunteer science to Qualtrics. This is opening up Qualtrics survey with this embedded data for this particular example. Both Qualtrics and volunteer science support embedded variables, so you can send embedded variables from Qualtrics to volunteer science and volunteer science back to Qualtrics. I'll show you how in a second. The limit, the reason why you would want to use embedded variables and wouldn't want to use embedded variables is that they're only working at the start of a study. You can't change embedded variables during a study, but they're good for opening up the page with the parameters that you need. So you want to make sure that the most typical use cases for embedded variables are making sure that your survey or your experiment start in the right condition. So this is good for sharing ID variables, so you can make sure, first things first, you save the IDs so you know which data is which. The next thing is randomization variables so that you know you're launching the right version of your study. And lastly, sending already collected data. That's something that I'll mention a couple of times, but the best thing that you can do is save your data as you get it rather than as one big block at the end. That way you don't lose data if somebody leaves early or forgets to, if somebody loses internet connectivity, for example, another reason why you lose data by not saving it at the end. So the first method of doing, for embedded variables, method one, you need to create the embedded links. Now this is done manually. You have to tell Volunteer Science or Northeast or Qualtrics what your embedded variables are going to be and what their values are. And you do that in these examples from earlier. So on the left-hand side, when you open up the iframe to Volunteer Science and Qualtrics, you would add your embedded variables at the end of the join category. So join category equals 1, 2, 3, question mark, user ID equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The question, right, I've done this incorrectly. It's experiments, so volunteerscience.com/experiments, question mark, join underscore category equals 1, 2, 3 or whatever. And then you do an ampersand other parameters, in this case, user ID 1, 2, 3. Same thing with Volunteer Science. When you're opening up the Qualtrics iframe in your code, you just add the parameters at the end of it. In this circle example, there isn't any parameters, but at the top here you can see, I've added the user ID equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 parameter. So you have to define it manually. This is not something that you can do automatically, but you can pipe text through. So Qualtrics has pipe text that you can pass variables created during the study. Same thing with Volunteer Science. You create your own variables, you can attach them to URLs. Now capturing that embedded data in Qualtrics is automatic. So they have this thing called survey flow. You click the survey flow editor, again, new interface, so it's a little bit of a different location, but it's the same thing. So you're in survey flow, you add a new element called that's setting embedded data, and then you give it the name of the variable in the URL with all the capitalization the same as you would. So in this case, user ID. And the default is that Qualtrics is going to capture user ID from the URL. So you just leave that as a default. There are ways to set new values, but that's a different task. On Volunteer Science, you need to add 3 lines of code to your study. The first code here, your variable params equals new URL search, basically just gets that list of parameters, anything that happens after the question mark, from your URL. And then all you have to do is use this param.get, and then whatever parameter key you're looking for. In this case, it's just user ID. And so what this does is it creates this variable user ID that is set to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because that's what was in that URL. And then you don't necessarily have to, but generally you want to save whatever those parameters are. In this case, because it's user ID, you definitely want to save it. And you do that by calling submit, passing the user ID variable. Okay, method 2 is a JavaScript message passing. Now this happens live. You can pass messages whenever, as long as both the website and the iframe are open. Both Qualtrics and Volunteer Science support JavaScript message passing. However, Qualtrics doesn't turn on or enable JavaScript in their surveys by default. So you want to make sure that that's enabled for your organization. Again, message passing happens live and dynamically. So whenever you call the message, Qualtrics or Volunteer Science are actually going to receive that message and you have to process it. So what this is good for is saving data as it's collected. So, every time somebody responds to one of the Flinker tasks, you can send the results of that data to Qualtrics and Qualtrics can save it, or vice versa. Again, good for making sure that you don't lose data. Synchronizing instruments, again, making sure that when the volunteer science study is over, Qualtrics moves on to the next page, or when the Qualtrics survey is over, volunteer science moves on to the next instrument. Sending big unstructured data. Now you can send data through the embedded variables, and most people will never see those URLs, so they can be big and unstructured. But it's much more convenient to send it through your message passing, JavaScript message passing, because it's easier for you to see the structure in it and make sure that if anything is wrong with it, you can debug it. So when if you're trying to send 1,000 tweets collected from volunteer science into Qualtrics or from Qualtrics into volunteer science, it's much easier to pass that as a JSON block using the JavaScript message passing system. So here's how it works. It works the same in volunteer science and in Qualtrics. And it doesn't matter whether they are the iframe or the home page. To send the message, you use parent.postMessage. And then whatever is in that first argument there, the user ID 12345, is the message that the other system is going to receive. And that star there is just making sure that it passes through all of the windows within your web page. On the receiving end, so if Qualtrics is receiving messages or volunteer science is receiving messages, you have to do two things. One, you have to create a function that just defines what happens when somebody receives a message. In this case, I'm expecting there to be a message about the user ID, and I'm expecting it to be structured with user ID. So I notice there the hyphen, so I can make sure that I kick out user ID later on, and then the actual ID itself. And so what I do is I say, create this function. I'm going to call it receive message. I could call it whatever I want. It's custom. It's up to you. Event is just a Scratch variable name that I use. Again, it can be whatever you want, but you have to be consistent with it. The next line, event.data.starts with. That's my way of figuring out, is this this message that I receive, is it the user ID? So does it start with user ID? And if so, what I'm going to do is I'm going to split this next line, user ID equals event.data.split. I'm splitting it on that hyphen there. So it's going to delete the hyphen and create a list of two items. It's just user ID and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm going to select that second item, which we're starting with 0 in our count. So it's the first item, not the 0th item. So the first thing you do is you create a message function that processes whatever those messages are that you get. The second thing that you do is you just add the event listener. So window.add event listener with message and then receive message. If you name your receive message function something different, just make sure you update it there. It can be, like I say, it can be whatever you want. Just be consistent. And that's it. That's how you pass messages dynamically. And create the function to do whatever you need to do with the data that you are passing. So a couple of examples. This first one is sending big data. Parent.postMessage tweets with a semicolon, and then your tweet JSON block. This is a totally made up example, but that's one example that you can do, sending all the tweets that you collect. Another one is again this coordination thing. So you say parent.postMessage, run the next experiment, and then your receive message function is looking for that phrase, run the next experiment, and when it does, it closes the iframe and moves on. You define that in the function. Lastly, sharing dynamic data. So going back to this example of the image tagging with the Facebook ad, the political ads from 2016. On the right-hand side, we have the Qualtrics surveys. So every time we finish the survey page, we can send that data from Qualtrics back to volunteer science that says this is a rating. It's item 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it was a positive image, and it was about puppies who were outdoors, or what have you. Again, this is a good way of saving data as it's being collected and linking it up to the specific images in this case that get tagged. So how does message passing work in a very abstract way? The iframe that's within the page can say, hello, here's some data, and then volunteer science or the window outside says, oh, I heard hello. Yes, I received the data. Let me do something with it. And it just works the same way going the other way. So volunteer science says, hello, here's some data. And Qualtrics says, oh, I heard hello. Yes, here's some data. I received the data. Let me process it. Okay, let me recap. What we talked about today was, why would you use volunteer science? Why would you use Qualtrics? Qualtrics is for really powerful, really easy to create surveys, and volunteer science is for everything else, frankly. All your cognitive tasks, your multiplayer studies, your social media data collection, your interactive web applications. To put a survey on volunteer science, you can either do it as its own study. So we have that Qualtrics survey template that you can use. You have your Qualtrics survey up on volunteer science in less than 5 minutes. The second one is embedding it in another study by pasting that iframe HTML within your existing study. The way that you embed volunteer science on Qualtrics is basically the same. You take that iframe code snippet for a volunteer science study and you put it in a Qualtrics text object or text question, text item. And lastly, we talked about passing information. So when you have your survey up on volunteer science, your study embedded in Qualtrics, you can pass data at the beginning of the study when those studies are first started, or when those survey or study is first started using embedded variables in the URL. Or you can pass data anytime using the JavaScript message passing capabilities. All right, thank you so much. If you have any questions, please send us an email at support@volunteerscience.com. I'm happy to answer them. And if you have other topics that you'd like to see us cover, please also send us a message or leave comments on this particular video. And thank you so much.